James Harrison had spent 18 years serving his community as a respected police officer in Millstone, a quiet Midwestern town. To his neighbors, he was a devoted father to 3 beautiful children and a loving husband to his wife, Rachel. Life appeared peaceful and ordinary, the way it often does in places like Millstone. But on the morning of June 14th, James made a discovery that would forever shatter his perception of family, trust, and the life he thought he knew. It started with an innocuous decision. His youngest daughter, Ava, had been asking questions about their ancestry for a school project. Wanting to provide answers, James ordered an at-home DNA testing kit for himself and Ava. It was a bonding activity, or so he thought, a way to explore their roots together. Weeks later, the results arrived. Sitting alone in his home office, James clicked on the email link that led him to a detailed report. The first few pages were unremarkable: ethnic origins, distant relatives. But as he scrolled down to the section labeled Close Family Matches, his heart stopped. There it was, in bold letters, a 99.9% match. His brother, Alan Harrison, wasn't just listed as an uncle to James's 3 children. The results clearly identified him as their biological father. James sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake, an error in the system. But as a police officer, he trusted evidence, and this evidence was undeniable. The brother he had grown up idolizing, the same man who had stood beside him as his best man at his wedding, had fathered his children. How long had this been going on? Did Rachel know? And why? Questions flooded James's mind, each one more devastating than the last. He replayed every interaction he had ever had with his brother and wife, searching for clues he might have missed. James kept the secret to himself, unsure of what to do next. He needed answers, but more than anything, he needed time to process what he had just uncovered. The Harrison family wasn't perfect, but James had always believed in their strength. He and Rachel had been married for nearly 2 decades. While their marriage had faced its challenges, long hours on the job, financial stress, they had always managed to pull through. Or so James believed. Alan had always been a part of their lives. A charismatic man with a magnetic personality, he was a frequent guest at their home. The kids adored him, and James had trusted him implicitly. Alan was family, after all. But now, James was questioning everything. Every shared laugh, every family gathering, every small gesture he had once taken for granted. What had he missed? And more importantly, what would he do now? James knew one thing for certain. His world would never be the same. What he had stumbled upon wasn't just a betrayal. It was a revelation that had the potential to destroy everything he held dear. Before we continue, we notice that over 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to the channel. If you're enjoying this story and want to see more content like this, please support us by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think. The days following James's discovery were filled with unbearable tension. He carried the weight of his newfound knowledge in silence, unable to confide in anyone. Every glance at Rachel felt like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Every interaction with Alan now seemed rehearsed, artificial. The 2 people he trusted most in the world had deceived him in a way he couldn't fathom. James avoided his family more than ever, spending long hours at work and finding excuses to stay out of the house. But as much as he tried to compartmentalize, the truth kept gnawing at him. He couldn't sleep. He barely ate. And the questions, those relentless questions, only grew louder in his mind. After a week of torment, James made a decision. He couldn't carry this alone anymore. One evening, after dinner, he asked Rachel to join him in the living room. His voice was steady, but the tension was unmistakable. Rachel noticed something was wrong, but she had no idea what was coming. "Rachel," James said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She looked confused but nodded. "Of course, James. What's going on?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had taken a screenshot of the DNA results, a single image that had turned his world upside down. He handed her the phone without saying a word. Rachel's expression shifted almost instantly. Her face drained of color, her breathing quickened. She looked at James, then back at the screen, as if searching for an explanation that didn't exist. "James," she began, her voice trembling. "I can explain." But there was no explanation that could undo what James had discovered. Her words stumbled over themselves, a desperate attempt to bridge a gap that was now too wide to cross. She admitted the truth. The affair with Alan had started years ago, during a rough patch in their marriage. She insisted it was a mistake, something that should have ended before it began. But it hadn't. And now, the evidence of her betrayal was undeniable. James sat in silence, staring at the woman he thought he knew. He wasn't just angry, he was devastated. The person he had built a life with, the mother of his children, had kept this secret from him for years. And it wasn't just her. Alan, his own brother, had betrayed him too. As the gravity of the situation settled in, James's anger erupted. His voice, usually calm and controlled, filled the room. "How could you do this to me? To us? To our kids?" Rachel broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She tried to justify her actions, saying she never meant for it to go this far, that she loved James, not Alan. But her words felt hollow, unable to pierce the wall of betrayal surrounding James. The confrontation with Rachel was just the beginning. James knew he couldn't avoid Alan forever. The next day, he called his brother and asked him to meet at a neutral location, a quiet spot at the edge of a nearby park. Alan, unaware of what James knew, agreed without hesitation. When Alan arrived, James wasted no time. "I know," he said, his voice cold and flat. Alan, initially confused, watched as James pulled out the same screenshot he had shown Rachel. Alan's reaction was different. There was no immediate denial, no attempt to explain. He simply looked at James, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," Alan said, barely above a whisper. "Sorry?" James snapped. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover this. You betrayed me, Alan. You betrayed our family." The conversation quickly escalated. James demanded answers. When it started, how long it lasted, and why Alan would do something so unforgivable. Alan tried to explain, but his words only deepened the wound. He admitted that the affair had lasted several years, and that he had convinced himself it wouldn't hurt anyone if it stayed a secret. For James, this wasn't just about the affair. It was about trust, loyalty, and the bond between brothers. Alan had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the damage was irreparable. By the time they parted ways, nothing had been resolved. James walked away feeling more alone than ever, carrying a storm of emotions he couldn't begin to process. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who valued justice and integrity above all else. But now, he was faced with a betrayal so personal, so profound, that he couldn't see a way forward. The confrontation had given him the answers he sought, but it hadn't brought him peace. If anything, it had only deepened his despair. The family he thought he knew was gone, replaced by a web of lies and betrayal. And James was left to pick up the pieces. Days turned into weeks, but the weight of the betrayal didn't lessen. If anything, it grew heavier, suffocating him. Every corner of his life felt tainted by the lies. At work, his colleagues noticed a change. James was quieter, withdrawn, a shadow of the man they once knew. At home, the atmosphere was tense, even with Rachel's desperate attempts to mend what had been broken. But James couldn't look at her, or the children, the same way anymore. Every time he glanced at their faces, he saw Alan. The shape of their noses, the color of their eyes, subtle features he had ignored before now screamed the truth. These were not his children, not biologically, and that realization cut deeper than he thought possible. Sleep became a fleeting luxury. James would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the revelations like a broken record. He tried to distract himself, throwing himself into his work, taking extra shifts, volunteering for the most grueling assignments. But the silence of the night always brought it back. The betrayal, the lies, the humiliation. He began to question everything. Had Rachel ever loved him? Was Alan always pretending to be the supportive brother? How many others had known about this and chosen not to tell him? His thoughts spiraled into dark corners, fueled by exhaustion and despair. One evening, after another sleepless night, James opened his laptop and started searching for answers. He wasn't looking for reconciliation. He was looking for control. He wanted to understand how people dealt with this kind of betrayal, how they moved on. But the stories he found were far from comforting. Infidelity forums, threads on family betrayal, they were filled with bitterness, anger, and stories of people who never truly recovered. The more he read, the angrier he became. These were stories of people whose lives had been ripped apart, just like his. People who were left to pick up the pieces, while the ones who betrayed them seemed to move on unscathed. And that was what gnawed at James the most. Rachel and Alan were still living their lives, still seeing his children. It felt like they had stolen everything from him. His family, his pride, his future. James tried to talk to a friend once, a fellow officer named Mark. Over coffee, he shared a carefully edited version of what had happened, leaving out the identities and the DNA test. But even in that sanitized version, James felt vulnerable, exposed. Mark listened, offering platitudes about moving forward and focusing on what really mattered. But his words felt hollow. James nodded along, thanked him, and never brought it up again. After that, James stopped trying to talk. No one could understand the depth of what he was feeling, the sense of betrayal that seemed to define his every waking moment. And so, he bottled it up, shoving it down until it became a part of him, an invisible weight he carried everywhere he went. But the anger was harder to contain. Little things began to set him off. A traffic stop that didn't go as planned, a minor disagreement with a colleague. His temper, once controlled and measured, started to flare in ways that surprised even him. At home, the smallest comments from Rachel or the kids would ignite arguments that left the house in uneasy silence. Rachel tried to reach him, to apologize again and again, but her words felt meaningless. Every time she said, "I'm sorry," it only reminded James of how much she had hurt him. Eventually, she stopped trying, retreating into her own silence. The kids, sensing the tension, kept their distance. The house that once felt warm and welcoming now felt like a battlefield, with everyone walking on eggshells. And then there was Alan. James couldn't bring himself to confront him again, but the thought of his brother consumed him. Every memory they had shared felt tarnished, a reminder of the betrayal that now defined their relationship. James wondered if Alan ever felt guilty, if he ever thought about the damage he had caused. But he didn't reach out. He couldn't. The anger was too strong. Instead, James began to keep tabs on Alan in secret. He drove past his house late at night, watched from his car as the lights went out. He noted the cars parked in the driveway, the patterns of Alan's routine. It wasn't about revenge, at least, that's what James told himself. It was about understanding, about finding some way to make sense of what had happened. But even as he watched, a darker part of him began to surface, whispering thoughts he wasn't ready to acknowledge. One night, after hours of sitting in his car outside Alan's house, James returned home to an empty kitchen. Rachel and the kids had gone to bed hours ago, but the silence was oppressive. He poured himself a drink, something he had been doing more and more lately, and sat at the table, staring at the glass in his hands. He thought about his life, the life he had built and the life that had been taken from him. He thought about Rachel, Alan, and the children. And for the first time, he allowed himself to admit what he had been avoiding for weeks. He didn't know how to move forward. The anger, the pain, the betrayal. It was too much. James sat there for hours, the drink untouched, as the weight of it all pressed down on him. When he finally stood, the first hints of dawn were creeping through the window. He went upstairs, closed the bedroom door behind him, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The darkness inside him was growing, and James could feel it. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew it wouldn't end well. For weeks, James lived on the edge, teetering between moments of forced normalcy and spiraling rage. His days followed the same bleak rhythm. Work, silence at home, sleepless nights, and the gnawing obsession with Alan. The once respected officer was unraveling, and even those closest to him could see the cracks forming. His colleagues whispered about his temper, his wife avoided confrontation, and his children kept their distance. But James couldn't let it go. He couldn't let Alan go. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It felt like an attack on everything James believed in: family, loyalty, honor. He told himself he was seeking justice, not revenge. But deep down, even he wasn't sure of the difference anymore. The breaking point came one evening in late October. James was finishing a shift when he received a call from Rachel. Her voice was shaky, hesitant. She told him Alan had come by the house earlier to drop off some things for the kids. Gifts, small tokens Alan often used to stay close to the family. She didn't think much of it, but to James, it was a provocation. "Why would you let him in?" James asked, his voice cold. Rachel stammered, trying to explain that it was a brief visit, that Alan had stayed at the door. But James didn't hear the details. All he heard was that Alan had been there, at his home, near his children. His mind raced, each thought sharper than the last. That night, James didn't go home. Instead, he drove to a secluded spot near the woods where he often went to think. But this time, there was no peace to be found. His thoughts were loud, chaotic. He replayed every moment of the betrayal, every word Alan had said during their confrontation. He thought about Rachel's complicity, about the life they had stolen from him. The pain turned to anger, and the anger turned to something darker. By the time James left the woods, he had made a decision. He didn't call it a plan, not yet. But in his mind, the path was clear. Alan couldn't keep living as if nothing had happened. He couldn't keep inserting himself into James's life, into James's family. Something had to be done. Over the next few days, James began preparing. It was subtle at first, small actions that didn't draw attention. He checked Alan's routine, confirmed what he already knew about his brother's habits. He made mental notes of the times Alan was alone, the places he frequented. It wasn't difficult. Alan lived a predictable life, one that James had been a part of for years. Then came the physical preparations. James cleaned his personal firearm meticulously, a ritual that had once been a source of pride in his line of work. He told himself it was precautionary, that he wasn't sure if he would use it. But deep down, he knew. The night of the crime began like any other. James waited until late, until the streets were quiet and the world seemed to hold its breath. He drove to Alan's house, parking a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. The walk to Alan's door was both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast, his thoughts racing with every step. When Alan answered the door, he looked surprised but not alarmed. "James? What are you doing here?" James didn't answer immediately. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Alan, sensing the tension, tried to defuse the situation. "Look, if this is about the other day, I didn't mean to," but James cut him off. "You didn't mean to? You didn't mean to ruin my life, Alan? My family?" The confrontation escalated quickly. Voices rose, accusations flew. Alan tried to defend himself, to justify his actions, but James wasn't listening. The anger he had bottled up for weeks was spilling over, uncontrollable and all-consuming. When it happened, it wasn't premeditated. Or at least that's what James would later tell himself. The gun was in his hand before he realized he had drawn it. Alan's expression shifted from anger to fear. "James, wait. Let's talk about this. You don't have to do this." But James's hands didn't shake. His voice was calm when he spoke. "You didn't think about that when you destroyed everything I had." The shot rang out, sharp and final. Alan fell to the floor, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, there was silence, a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow the room whole. But James wasn't finished. His mind was already racing to the next step. He had crossed a line, one he couldn't uncross, and he knew it. The only thought that remained was Rachel. He couldn't leave things unfinished. James drove home, his thoughts a blur. The house was dark when he arrived. Rachel was in the kitchen, washing dishes, oblivious to what had just happened. When she turned to see him standing in the doorway, she smiled faintly. "You're home late." James didn't respond. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Rachel," he said softly, "we need to talk." She saw the gun before he raised it. Her eyes widened, her hands trembling as she tried to speak. "James, please, whatever you're thinking, don't do this." But in that moment, James couldn't hear her. The rage, the betrayal, the pain, it all boiled over. There was another shot, and then the silence returned. When it was over, James sat at the kitchen table, the gun resting on the wood beside him. The house was quiet, eerily so. He didn't know how much time had passed when he finally stood, walking out the door and into the night. What he had done couldn't be undone. The man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law had become the very thing he once swore to fight against. And deep down, he knew there was no going back. James didn't run. He didn't try to hide. He left the house and drove aimlessly through the empty streets of Millstone, his mind a cacophony of guilt, relief, and a chilling sense of finality. Hours later, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, James pulled into the parking lot of the police station, the very place where he had spent nearly 2 decades building a career in law enforcement. He sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the building. This wasn't how his story was supposed to end. He had always envisioned himself retiring with honor, surrounded by friends and family, a legacy of service left behind. But now, all of that was gone. He had destroyed everything, and he knew it. When James finally walked into the station, his uniform was stained, his face expressionless. Officers greeted him out of habit, their smiles fading as they noticed his state. Without a word, James walked to the desk sergeant, placed his firearm on the counter, and said 4 words that sent a chill through the room. "I've done something terrible." The confession was immediate, detailed, and without hesitation. James recounted every moment of the night before, from the confrontation with Alan to the final moments with Rachel. His colleagues listened in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the story he was telling. This wasn't just another case. This was one of their own. News of the murders spread quickly. Millstone, a town unaccustomed to such violence, was thrown into shock. James Harrison, the decorated officer, the devoted father, the man everyone respected, had committed 2 brutal murders. The media descended on the small town, turning the tragedy into a national spectacle. Headlines screamed of betrayal, family secrets, and a respected officer turned killer. The trial was swift, but not without its complications. James's defense attorney argued that the years of betrayal and emotional distress had driven him to an uncontrollable breaking point. They painted a picture of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits, whose life had been systematically dismantled by the people closest to him. But the prosecution focused on the cold, calculated nature of the crime. The planning, the execution, and the fact that James had shown no hesitation. Witnesses were called to testify, friends, colleagues, neighbors, all of whom spoke of James's character before the crime. They described him as kind, loyal, and dedicated, but even their words couldn't erase the weight of his actions. Rachel's family sat in the courtroom, their grief palpable, while Alan's relatives watched in stunned silence, struggling to make sense of it all. When James took the stand, his voice was steady but filled with regret. He didn't try to justify what he had done. Instead, he spoke of the pain, the betrayal, and the rage that had consumed him. "I let it control me," he said, "and now I have to live with the consequences." The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was guilty on all counts. James Harrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, James sat motionless, staring straight ahead. There was no protest, no plea for leniency. He had accepted his fate. In prison, James became a subject of fascination. Some inmates respected him for his years in law enforcement, while others saw him as a cautionary tale. A man who had everything and lost it all. He spent his days in quiet reflection, rarely speaking unless spoken to. The once proud officer had become a shadow of himself, haunted by the faces of the people he had loved and lost. Back in Millstone, the community struggled to heal. The Harrison home remained vacant, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Neighbors whispered about the family, their voices tinged with a mix of sorrow and curiosity. Alan and Rachel's secrets were now public knowledge, and the story became something of a cautionary tale, a reminder of how even the strongest bonds could be destroyed by betrayal. The children, now orphans, were placed with relatives far from Millstone. Their names were shielded from the media, but their story followed them wherever they went. They carried the weight of their parents' choices, growing up in the shadow of a tragedy they couldn't escape. For those who knew James, the story was one of profound loss, not just for the victims, but for James himself. He was a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, to protecting others. But in the end, he had become a man defined by his failure to protect the people who mattered most. This story isn't just about betrayal or murder. It's about the fragility of trust, the devastating consequences of secrets, and the lengths to which a person can be driven when their world falls apart. James Harrison's actions were unforgivable, but they serve as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist within even the most trusted among us. For those left behind, the wounds may never fully heal. But for James, his punishment is more than a prison sentence. It's the knowledge that he destroyed his own life and the lives of everyone he loved. And for the rest of us, it's a story we'll never forget.